Welcome back from lunch. My name is Bob Wood. I'm with AFC International, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panel, our first panel this afternoon. We have a total of 4 panels that'll discuss a variety of cyber and cyber topics, everything from roles and responsibilities to threats and cross-agency reporting to international cyber concerns. We're very fortunate to lead off with our first panel today. Our moderator, our lead panelist is John Felker. Let me give you a little details about each of these panelists, although I have an opportunity to provide any other items from their background or experience that they wish to highlight. But I can tell you it's an impressive panel of experts who worked in the area of cybersecurity and national strategy for a long time. John is currently the manager of operations in National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. That's NCIC, for those of us who've had an opportunity to work with them. NCIC at DHS, where he's really involved in information sharing and response coordination. It certainly stems from his background, 20 years in the Coast Guard, deputy commander of the Coast Guard Cyber Command when it first stood up, and commanded the U.S. Coast Guard Cryptological Group. We've had an opportunity to work with John in a variety of areas as AFCEA, and we thank him for his expertise and today for his ability to help us through the subjects we'll deal with. 2 other experts on the panel with John. Beth Dunphy is a program director, IBM Cybersecurity Technologies, within the office of the IBM CISO. Security of IBM corporate environments is key in her workload, and also protecting IBM clients, building and leading teams, fielding solutions, and developing global security and compliance services. She started in the Air Force, where she did computer network defense work, and as an Air Force officer saw the defense side, and now has, I think, great insights to offer today from the IBM and corporate side. We also have with us Robert Carey from GDIT. He's the Vice President, Cybersecurity, Cloud, Unified Capability Solutions, working particularly solutions for DoD. 31 years working with DoD, 3.5 years principal deputy in the DoD CIO office, worked with the Joint Information Environment as that was getting underway. Started in the Army at Aberdeen as an engineer at Aberdeen, working solutions there, and moved to the Navy in 1985. Frankly, he has a long list of distinguished engineering service and solutions that he's worked on, fielded a whole variety of expertise, and in particular worked a lot in cybersecurity in the DoD space, but has a lot of GDIT experience as well. He retired from the United States Navy Reserve as a captain. We have a great panel today to offer their insights. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the panel to the stage.
Thank you, General. One thing I do want to say before we get started is I want to mention that in addition to Rob's great service with the Army and with the Navy, I met him first at the Naval Postgraduate School when I was in a short senior executives course out there. And the thing that I remember the most about Rob is that he is a disruptor. So part of the discussion, I'm sure today, will revolve around his ability to make us think. And I think that's an important, thing that Rob brings to the table here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the biggest challenges that we face in cybersecurity. We're going to talk about it from a couple of different perspectives: the perspective that I have within the government, and then the commercial view of things. I think that'll help us kind of frame what we think are the biggest problems. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is the biggest challenge, and then I'm going to have Beth and Rob talk about that as well. We have, as you might expect, this is a panel, so we have some canned questions that we've talked about, but we would also encourage you to be thinking about what we have to say, and don't hesitate to get up and ask questions, and please do challenge the disruptor. So from my perspective as the director of the NCIC, the biggest challenge that we have, and we talked about this a little bit before the panel, is how do we effectively share information? For too long, information is seen as a competitive advantage or a commodity that you don't share. And I think we've gone well past that stage. I think we have to figure out ways to share information rapidly, that is actionable. And in my world, where we are constantly balancing between classified and unclassified, sharing it at an unclassified level so a broad audience of people can use that information. So I'll leave it there with respect to information sharing. We'll talk about it a little bit more. I think it's really important, a really important thing that we need to think about how to do better. And I'll talk a little later on about some things that we're trying to do in the NKIC that facilitate more effective information sharing. So Beth?
Sure, thank you. So I absolutely agree that the information sharing is certainly one of our big challenges in the cybersecurity space. But for me, and in particular my experience, I've seen that the talent and the cybersecurity skills shortage is one of our also primary problems. By 2020, we're expected to have about 1.5 million gap or shortage of cybersecurity skilled individuals to be able to help our countries and companies and governments secure our systems and data, and we're not educating and growing the talent fast enough or finding the possibly skilled talent fast enough to do that. One more perspective on that is also being a woman. I'm one of only about 10% of women in the cybersecurity career field. So we also need to find ways to attract a more balanced cybersecurity workforce coming from not just both genders, but all types of experience, throughout their career, IT, business, legal, finance, all of those have value, and we're looking at how we can bring those in to address that gap, and I'll certainly address that more in my comments.
So, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, John. I think disruptor means troublemaker to me, which I don't mind.
I didn't think you would.
No, it's not at all. So the passion that I have right now is about trying to solve this problem, right? The cybersecurity problem. In that, if a CISO or a CIO wants to go buy something to protect a part of their network, can anyone articulate the so what, right? If I buy a better firewall or I buy some tool I don't have today, what did I get for the money I spent? What are the metrics we use? What are the metrics that define good enough, right? We've defined our state of play in very qualitative terms, not quantitative terms. And so if you look back at the last 25 years, and John and I have been in this business a long time, playing that game for another 25 years will lead us exactly down the same path we're on. So I'm trying to sort of start a movement about, let's think about working on solving this problem piece by piece, that we can then have metrics so you know what good enough is, you know what tools work, and you know how well they work.
So let's dig into that a little bit, Rob. What sort of, besides return on investment, let's take me as a government customer, for example. How would you propose that I define what's good enough? We talked a little bit earlier about setting the bar at a response time of X. 24 hours, is that fast enough? Is 2 days fast enough? Or should I be thinking about understanding that my network has been intruded upon within 2 minutes?
So I go back to in the Navy and in my civilian jobs in the Army, there were hard operational metrics around submarines, torpedoes, weapon systems in the Army that you could measure very succinctly, inputs and outputs. When you get into the cyber world, this gets fuzzy very quickly. How do you define that? So for example, in the ready room, we were talking about what's the time frame for detection that should be the bar of you're okay? Is it an hour? Is it 10 minutes? Is it a day? And you all read the same data that I've read, where the detection time is averaging hundreds of days, right? So not only is your stuff gone, it's been gone. It's been gone so long, you just don't even know it. So I'm trying to start I think we need to start thinking about working the problem from what's acceptable, staying inside the bad guy's OODA loop, as opposed to being far outside of it, right? which is where we are today. And using tools that bring that to bear, using our national assets and our laboratories to start to figure this out. Today, I don't know anybody that's in the CISO business that claims he's got it or she's got it covered, right? We're fighting this battle to just keep our fingers in the dike, and that's not going to work. If the Equifax stats are right, half of this room just got hacked, right, a couple days ago. And I'm sure Equifax has a reasonably secure set of tools that protects their information, right? What's the minimum set of tools you must have to be declared to be a good enough network infrastructure from a security perspective? What is that set? That's not defined anywhere, right? We all know there's basic tools, but some people have some extravagant tools that work really well. Okay, what is that additive benefit for what cost, right?
So let's look at Equifax a little bit. So they went public a couple of days ago. The actual intrusion started as early as potentially July, maybe even earlier. So Beth, if we talk about intrusion, getting into a system, time to detect, time to respond, time to mitigate as milestones along the way of a response in that box. What do you look for at IBM in terms of any kind of metrics like that?
So, we're looking at not only our coverage, how much of our environment is covered so that we can detect, as you can imagine, with 500,000 users in 170, 80 countries globally, our footprint is very large, well over 1 million endpoints to cover. So we've got to look at not only coverage metrics, but then we've got to look at how quickly can we get that information to our security operations team so that they can actually respond. And that's really the focus of my team, is the right coverage and getting that to the tools so that operators can do their job effectively. And honestly, we need it in minutes to hours, because that's the time frame that the bad guys are working in. But there's a fine balance, and this is where we're hitting up against technology, is that our SOC team can only respond as effectively as the technology gets it to them. So it is a balance, but I can tell you for one thing, right now, the weeks to months, 6 weeks or more to get us intelligence is definitely far too slow. And likewise, we need to do a better job sharing back with the government, because, again, with our large footprint and many other multinationals like IBM, I'm sure we have information that would be equally as valuable for us to share back in a timely manner. And we've made our X-Force Threat Exchange available to do that. So we are continuing to push that and to be able to share back so that all teams can respond very quickly.
So that's a good point about the place where we're trying to go in the NKIC is we see a lot of information. We see a lot of things going on, both classified and unclassified, but we're sort of confined to a small slice of the pie. The federal law enforcement, federal intelligence community, Defense Department, and departments and agencies, the information that we actually see and can put our fingers and hands on and understand what it is. One of our efforts in this information sharing world is to take what we have and generate a quick and dirty product that says, this is going to be useful for cyber defenders. We're going to push it out to them as rapidly as we can. We've developed this based upon what we're seeing in our networks. Will you please take a look at it at IBM? Will you please take a look at it at GDIT and give me an answer in an hour as to, is it a worthwhile product for cyber defenders? Is it something that we've gotten right or wrong? Are there things that we can do to make it better, stronger, by the way, in 2 hours, so we can push it out to cyber defenders? The reason we're talking about time frames here, and I think I would say that the audience probably knows this, but just because you have an intrusion on 1st of July doesn't mean you're owned on the 1st of July. It doesn't mean you've lost a significant amount of data on the 1st of July, because the adversary has to establish a presence. They have to be able to move laterally within your network to be able to understand where those things are. And one of the things I was going to ask you too is, as you're looking at those time scales, how do you determine what you're going to protect? And is there a different scale for protecting X and Y? And if so, how do you make that determination? I mean, data is not just data. Some data is more valuable than others.
Absolutely.
And Rob, if you'll think about it, I'll ask you the same question when Beth finishes.
Sure. So, I mean, kind of back to the prior question too. In absence of any data, we're blind, right? So I would rather have some information saying, we know this is happening, here's some of the parameters that we can share with you now, rather than this perfect ticked and tied, reviewed by the lawyers 10 times, and it's too old to be of any value. So having something sooner, anything, is gonna help us be able to just move the needle a little further ahead and be able to respond that much faster. But to your question about how do we differentiate in our response, that goes to data classification. And I mean, I know classification obviously in the government is different than maybe in the commercial world, but we still have the same sense of confidential information or crown jewels information, things that are more important to us. And we do have a different time scale in which we'll respond to those, and certain incidents that involve those crown jewels are going to escalate immediately. And we want to know anything and everything about those types of situations. But, to put it back at you, you don't know what's important to us. We have to do a better job at communicating with you to help you understand if you see intelligence about this type of incident or involving these types of assets. Watson being hacked, heaven forbid, right? But we would want to know that. That's critical to our business, and it's critical to our customers' business. So we should be talking and have a very, back and forth cheery dialogue about that all the time, not just when something significant happens or every, month when we're able to get information.
That's a really good point. I mean, those of you in the room that know Thad Allen, one of the things that he likes to say is it doesn't do us any good to share business cards in the middle of a disaster. So we need to start developing these relationships before the disaster happens, so that we can pick up the phone and say, hey, Beth, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? So, Rob.
So I think the sensitive data thing is, it comes down to how much you're willing to spend to protect your sensitive information. I guess I can look at FedRAMP. You look at IL 123456, right? And the sets of controls get increasingly more complex and more rigorous to protect information that's going to go out in a cloud environment. That being said, there is no mapping to the actual effectiveness of those controls. So, in theory, you put your most sensitive information behind, lots of barriers and defenses to make it more difficult to get at. But at the same time, if those barriers don't actually protect, right, then you haven't done anything, right? You make yourself feel good. You spent money on it, but this is about making that sensitive data a hard target, right? And then in the DoD world, we tend to classify things, and when they get up on those classified networks, they're wrapped around a big layer of cryptography, and that costs money, but it also works. And then if you get even more sensitive data, you have bigger layers of cryptography. That costs even more money. So the question is, for controlled unclassified information, or the old FOUO, how much should you spend, right? And what's that ecosystem look like? That's covered by the NIST standards and things like that. And frankly, it's checklisty oriented, controls oriented, not effects oriented. So John, I look at this and I say, how do you measure and stay somewhat inside the bad guy's OODA loop for this information to go out the door? And what's the appropriate time that you should be measured to say detection is how many minutes, how many hours? I don't think that anyone is building tools that are in that time frame. And as you move forward, you sort of have to think that we've got to catch up to this guy's ability to stay inside. You mentioned, like, hey, if he gets in, is he going to take the stuff right away? If he's really good, it could happen quickly, but generally there's lots of things that go on before things start to happen. But this Equifax thing is a typical example. 60 days later, we're finding out, or 90 days later, that this occurred. Okay, that game's over. It's been over. So what would you do differently, right? If you had a detection trigger, you could take an action. So I think providing you guys in the NCIC, for example, with an ability to take an action based upon some known event. And the challenge that I've had, let me close with this, as a CIO guy, I sort of got bracketed with, I'm all about information sharing, which I am. But I think there's a point in time when the mission is more compromised by letting the mission move forward on the internet than it is by actually, sort of sandboxing some communication, sandboxing a transaction. Because things that go through, suddenly the bad guy knows that he's found pay dirt, and now the discrete exfiltration starts.
So, in that construct that you both have laid out, what do we think about the direction that the White House is currently taking? And I'll just pull one of them off of the list of things that are on the EO. And it doesn't explicitly say this, but there's a general thought that we may go this way, and that is that all of the civilian departments and agencies should operate on the same architecture, the same system, and potentially have one SOC operating the whole thing. And then how does that play into the differences in the holdings and the importance of the data at HHS versus what's at FEMA versus what's at the Social Security Administration?
So I think in many regards, having a common playing field, having common standards, common architecture certainly helps everybody understand what is trying to be secured. But at the end of the day, that's all really going to just help make it easier to repeat the attacks for the attackers. So if I know that Agency A or Agency B have implemented the same tools in the same way, they're very likely also misconfigured the same way, and I can probably get into both agencies or multiple agencies the same way. So from my experience, I'm not a fan of homogeneity across multiple organizations because each organization is unique. It has its own unique security requirements, its own risk tolerance, its data it's protecting is different. And while there's certainly value in having bulk purchasing and things like that, or having a common understanding of an architecture, at the end of the day, having a little bit of complexity and a little bit of difference can go a long way to making it that much harder for the bad guy.
That's a good point, and I'd argue that our national election infrastructure is very much non-homogeneous. We did when all the election shenanigans was going on last fall, we did a look at the different states and how they manage their election systems. And by the way, an ongoing process within DHS. But it is remarkable how different each state is. And I think that's a function of our system of government. Actually, it's a state, or in some cases, it's a local precinct responsibility for that. And so by definition, it is different, and it's much more difficult to hack. And some would argue, although Ted Kopp will probably not, that the electric grid is set up much the same way. It's been set up over a period of time, and it is not homogeneous, and that then makes it much more difficult to break into. But one of the things we talked about on the call, Rob, was the ubiquity now of control systems in the electric grid, for example, that are connected to the internet. What sort of a challenge do you see with that kind of a structure?
Well, so the benefits of the old term web enabling are now internet enabling infrastructure. So IoT is almost upon us. Some would say it is upon us. But remember what we were just talking about. We're sort of choking on the network we have today, not the attack surface exploding with every single building control having an IP address. The advent of IPv6 is not that far away. And so I think the challenge is really about getting our heads around, and this is the ultimate of heterogeneity of network infrastructure, right? All these things out there, in the DoD it would be called battlefield of things, the BOT, if you will. But protecting that requires a different view on the network, because now the network is not the network you had. It's this network of things out there you never thought about trying to command and control. And to the statement that you made before, John, I think that there's a balance between command and control of the network and the same homogeneous network infrastructure and the affordability of that, and affording enough lateral diversity to now disrupt lateral movements, right? But when we get to IoT and we start to figure out that, wow, you've all seen the Jeep Cherokees getting hacked, you've seen Hart things getting hacked. I mean, everything that has an IP address can be hacked. And so that strikes fear in the hearts of many, but in the diversity there's also some, I think, safety, right? Because it takes a lot to now manage that. So things like Watson and that unbelievable compute capacity necessary to take the data from all those devices, bring it in and make sense of it is an absolute must in the future. So if we're not aiming at that, I think this will become a giant headache for us, because already with smartphones, right, the attack surface in tablets has just exploded. And frankly, you know, we've said this many times before, you know, the convenience of having that device in your hot little hand is the bane of security, right? Convenience wins all the time. Security does not win. So how do we make that a reality so that if you're running the NKIC or you're running the SOC and your devices are running around some country or some area, how do you command and control those things from a central location so that you have some reasonable chance of defending your surface?
So if we look into history, raise your hand if you know what a meter reader is. Raise your hand the last time you saw one within a month. Now, see, that's the point.
Years.
Your meter has an IP address, and that points to the ubiquity of this connection that Rob is talking about. So how does a big smart, I don't know the right term that you use for Einstein, but a big smart data engine, how does Einstein or Watson figure out how to better defend in a dispersed Internet of Things environment like we're in?
Well, so we've spent the better part of the last couple of years helping Watson learn its corpus of security information. And it's being applied to many other problems outside of cybersecurity, but it is going to take automation, whether it's, you know, Watson, machine learning, some form of, you know, other cognitive technology. The fact of the matter is, with, you know, an estimated 20 billion IoT devices out there in just the next few years, and they're creating zettabytes of data, we can't make this a people problem. It's got to take automation. We've got to use technologies such as Watson and many others that are being developed across industry and across the government labs to be able to take that big data and transform it into something meaningful, so that our limited talent, you know, the cybersecurity professionals that are in place today are able to make sense of it and determine, you know, are we actually being hacked? You know, do we have a problem?
Okay, so you talked about cybersecurity professionals, and we're going to kind of change gears here a little bit and talk about the talent. The talent crisis, I think, is a good way to frame it. Before I do that, remember that if you have some questions, be thinking about them. In the next 5 minutes, we'll ask you to go to the microphones and ask any questions that you have. So I read in the paper last week that there was a significant deficit of cyber talent in the federal government. And I would argue that there is probably a deficit of cyber talent, not just in the federal government, but across the board. What are some things that we could do to mitigate that deficit? And I don't mean right at the door where how can I find 10 more people to bring in? What are some things that we need to do in the long term to make sure that we have a workforce that we can draw upon that has the skills that we need?
So there's a couple things that I can just speak to from my own experience at IBM. We've got kind of a short term, how are we addressing the problem now? Because absolutely in industry, we have every bit as much of a cyber skills shortage as the government's facing. So in the short term, we're looking at something we've called the new collar worker. And that's how do we bring in the people with the right aptitude and the right attitude, the passion for doing security that may have adjacent skills. So earlier I mentioned, you know, it's not just technology, it's also many other fields, be it legal or finance or business. And so if you've got the passion and the interest, we can teach you security. And so we've undertaken that across IBM in not only our CISO team, but in our IBM Security Business Unit. We're looking for talent in non-traditional sources. Veterans are one of those large sources for us because of the attitude and aptitude that their military training brings them. But we're also playing a longer game and looking at high school of the future and the P-Tech schools, because we really believe long-term cybersecurity skills have to start in the high school classroom as soon as they're having those first technology classes, even maybe down to elementary, but at minimum by high school. And it's not just a conversation, do you want to grow up and be a computer programmer, but do you want to grow up and be a cybersecurity professional? and making sure that the college programs that they fall into later aren't just theoretical, but they're practical and they have applied learning. I can't tell you the number of interns I interviewed last year for our intern program, and the majority of them had a basic theory class in security, but they had never actually tried to implement a system. They weren't in labs playing with the technology and really seeing how it worked. And so we're trying to partner with educational institutions for that long game to make sure the skills of tomorrow understand what cybersecurity is all about and can apply it.
Rob, how important do you think a ticket punch is, like a CISSP or a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering, is to measuring the potential success for a cyber worker, given the construct that Beth just laid out for us with aptitude and attitude being important?
So I think those things are enablers, right? And I just was sponsoring a senior class project at George Mason with cybersecurity, the first class of cybersecurity guys graduating with a degree in cybersecurity engineering. And I actually challenged them with the metrics question, and I got a lot of blank stares today, but that's okay. We'll work into smiles. But I think that
Early in the semester.
That's right. Well, yeah, I get to meet with them every 2 weeks till May. But I think that the credentialing puts your head around what the state of the problem is today, right? And as we talked about, what's the high school of the future? Remember when you were taught by your mom and dad that you look both ways to cross the street, right? We were all taught that. Today, with the advent of the internet and electronic devices, phones, things like that, you must understand a level of security like you could cross the street safely without thinking about it. We're not there yet. That has not occurred yet. So I think that as you move kids from grammar school to junior high to high school to college to the workforce, and they start to gather up credentials, they gather knowledge, they have the ability to understand, ooh, that does make sense. Because when I challenge these kids today with some of the questions that we've talked about here, I could see the little light bulbs going on. I could see them grown because it's hard, but I could see them understanding, how do I go justify how much I spent on this tool, and I could demonstrate that it was worth it, right? Or I could even come close to that. So John, I think all those credentials, Certified Ethical Hacker, I think CISSP, Security Plus, you name it, they provide a fundamental that helps the workforce engage in this space. And we've already said we're so understaffed, it's almost a crisis right now. So these kids do know, these 60 young men and women, know that the minute they graduate, if they have those credentials, they are employable at a pretty good salary too. So I think they're excited that I hold their graduation in balance.
So we've talked about that at a strategic level. How do you, let me propose a methodology to you and get your thoughts on how this might work in both of your respective company. The job announcement goes out that says I need X, and it's a cybersecurity X of whatever flavor. If you're interested, fill out this form, and the form gets filled out and it gets reviewed by an HR professional, and it meets all the requirements for the job requisition. And an email goes back to the person. It's got a link in it that says, click on this link, and you're going to be given an aptitude test. And through 3 successive levels of aptitude, if you pass, you go to the next, and so forth. You get to 3 completed, and you've actually put hands on keyboard in a test that is measuring against the job requisition. And then if you've passed, you come in and you sit down and you have an interview with the team to understand whether or not you fit on that team. I won't name the company, but it's a big company that does this now. Is there something like that in GDIT or something like that in IBM that you are actually, this is now at a tactical level, rather than creating this long-term plan to grow kids into cyber literate people that could work in this workforce? What are we doing today to address the problem today?
So we have an abbreviated form of that. It's not as rigorous as you have sort of illustrated, but there is such a shortage. These kids with degrees, with grade point averages, the fitting in is the biggest problem. So can you think on your feet, and do you fit in culturally to the environment you're about which to work? That's an important layer that you can't overlook. We also have found that most of these kids that are coming right out of school have had a lot of seminars. They haven't sat in, for example, what you might learn at San Antonio, at Pensacola, or at Fort Gordon. You go through a schoolhouse in the military. So they've learned sort of at a level above that. And the experiential learning of coming in and having my fingers on a keyboard, operating a SIM, operating an endpoint security system, and sort of seeing the network from the inside, right, is very powerful. So the combination of their aptitude plus that giving them some experiential learning makes them a really viable candidate for us. So I think we're working on how to get that, but there's such a shortage, and frankly, you know, the workforce is older, right? There's a lot of us that are beyond 40, and so how many positions are out there for a 22-year-old who just graduated with a 3.6, and they suddenly expect to be making this, and then the jobs are, some that are at the level, some are not. So we're trying not to drag them through too much of a novel before we bring them aboard.
Beth?
So we have a limited version of what you suggested. I thought you were taking me down the rabbit hole of a phishing attack there for a second, but clicking.
I'm not that smart.
But we do some basic technical testing, and I'll tell you, we see a lot of resumes that are overinflated. So I would really like to see more of a system like you're proposing, because I get folks in for interviews all the time, and I really want to know their expertise is what is on their resume. And that's a very time-intensive process right now for hiring. But the good news is there's people out there that's interested. They're trying to get into the door. We just have to make sure that our expectations on what we need and their skills and their aptitude are matched up, and then we can go from there.
We're going to try something like that in the NKIC. We've had to go through the OPM dance a little bit to get the permissions to do it, but we're going to give that a go, and I'll be happy to share some of the results with you. I know that the large company that I mentioned before has been quite successful, so we expect to see some similar results.
Part of our information sharing, right?
Yep. We're having a lot of success with doing internships.
Yep, we are too.
It's not a lot of money,
Yes.
and you get to evaluate, you get to see them every day,
Every day.
and give them things to do, see how they respond, so how much you do what you just suggested in real time. So over a summer, you can already decide, hey, I have this guy back in a heartbeat, or this gal back, or, you know, it's okay, just didn't fit.
Yeah, we did that last summer. We had 16 interns within my organization. One has graduated and is coming back to work for us just in a few short weeks, and we have 3 more that we're keeping as co-ops throughout the next school year till they graduate. So we do find that the intern program is incredibly successful.
For those of you that don't know, the NKIC in particular and DHS overall, we also are very intimately involved in the scholarship for service. So we get those kids usually in the summer after their junior year for an internship to get an evaluation, and then their schools are paid for. So I'd like to ask if there are questions. There are microphones on either of the side aisles if you'd like to get up and ask a question. Don't wait on me to call you. Just go to the microphone and do it.
Right back there.
While he's going back, if you're interested at all in talking to me more specifically about scholarship for service stuff, and if you're connected to any of the universities, particularly in this area, please don't hesitate to grab me afterwards. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm John Krieger with MITRE. I appreciate the conversation, particularly about trying to quantify the amount of investments you should make with risk, the workforce deficiency we have in the cybersecurity space. And it's not clear to me that our conversation 5 years ago would have been much different than it is here. That we know that we were going to have a workforce deficit. If you look at the data, we continue to invest more every year and lose more data files. 2017 is ramping up to be the largest, biggest year of loss of files, and that wasn't even anticipating the Equifax loss. So what I would ask is, as we think about going into the future, so we're not having this conversation again in another 5 years about sharing data and we should invest more and how much should we invest. What are some of the disruptive technologies that you would think or consider that might change the game for us? Everybody talks about quantum, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Is there anything particular that, from your points of view, that are those disruptive technologies that might change the game for us? Thanks.
That's a good question. I'll let the disruptor take that first.
So, I would say, in my mind, because I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, right? This technology world goes a whole lot faster than that. I look for, take this the wrong way, Beth, but I look for things like Watson to become somewhat commonplace, right? The ability to grind through this plethora of data and make sense of it in near real time, right, is the disruptor here. I look for smartphone capability to continue to expand, and I look for cryptography that's lightweight in nature. Remember cryptography 5 years ago just sucked down the processor power of the network, so it was very difficult to encrypt things and make sure, and it stayed that way. So I see things like that. I see AI coming about. I see the combination of big data analytics, signatures, and AI as being the thing that covers the entire outfield, not just parts of it, which means there are gaps. So I see those kinds of things continuing to evolve to a point where they can be measured and make a difference. Today, they are not there. There is no way to measure their impact. And so I think disruptive is an interesting term because you want to say aha, but the aha, I mean, I haven't seen an aha recently. IBM Labs probably has dozens of them, but I haven't seen an aha that is operationalized yet.
What do you think, Beth?
So I would love to see Watson be commonplace, and we are working
Capabilities
to
like
make it to it, right? But no, there is a lot of development out there, and your point about we're having a conversation that we had probably 5 years ago is very fair. Honestly, I've had similar conversations for the past 20 years between government and industry. We aren't doing enough. We aren't sharing enough, and we've got to find a way to break through those walls to do it, because right now the perspective is if you're not sharing intelligence, you're part of the problem. So if we could find a way to break through that barrier of not sharing and not trusting and automate that sharing, I could see that being disruptive in the next few years. But I would love to see more organizations leveraging technologies such as, not only, but such as Watson, and machine learning, because I think there is a lot of potential there that's untapped yet. But the information sharing, to me, I have to go back to that. It's critical. We've got to break through the not sharing and not be part of the problem.